every metric that we cared about was moving in the proper direction, specifically heart rate variability. We saw day-to-day compounding improvements. Right, so if we were to extend the intervention phase a little bit longer, there's no doubt that this would have reached a state of statistical significance. But the fact that we also saw the decreased resting heart rate, which the AHA will tell you all day, we want as low of a resting heart rate as possible, improvements in sleep efficiency, confirmed what we essentially already knew around pain and range of motion and such. But just to look at every single one of our metrics and to see everything trending in the right direction, and really no maladaptation, nothing where we saw that we're perhaps introducing some unknown risk to the participants. It's always good to look at these variables as well. I think it confirms once again what we already know. We're directly impacting the autonomic nervous system. Now it's about bringing it back to the drawing board and just refining our protocols a little bit.
I'm Garrett Salpeter, and I believe that the most powerful and transformative way to help people recover from pain and injury, heal from trauma, and reach their highest levels of fitness and performance is to focus on the nervous system. In this podcast, we'll share knowledge from the frontiers of neuroscience and inspirational stories of how applying that knowledge has empowered people from all walks of life to heal, adapt, and grow. Welcome to this episode of the Undercurrent Podcast. I'm joined by Ramona von Leden, our Director of Research here at NeuFit, and special guest Kevin Longoria, the Chief Science Officer of BioStrap. And we're here to talk today about the results of a first initial pilot study that we did, NeuFit with BioStrap. And we basically used BioStrap. We'll give Kevin a chance to share what that technology is. We used BioStrap to measure the effects of what was happening with people when they just went through basic NeuFit treatments. Nothing special, none of our, master reset or anything especially targeted at the autonomic nervous system, just basic treatments, see what happens. And let's dive in and talk about what happened. So Kevin and Ramona, thank you both for being here. Can we start with you, Kevin? We'll give you a chance to introduce yourself and tell everyone listening what BioStrap is and why it's such an exciting measurement tool.
Yes, sir. Absolutely. Thanks for having me on the podcast today. So my name is Kevin Longoria, Chief Science Officer here at BioStrap. By education, I'm a clinical physiologist and a bit of a quasi-biometric data scientist. So for BioStrap, what I focus on is internal and external research and validation, really looking at our biometrics relative to the gold standard, which we'll dive into here in just a moment, as well as looking at interesting use cases for wearable technology. So BioStrap, in its essence, is a digital health platform developed to improve human health and performance. So what we combine here is clinically validated biosensors. A wrist-worn wearable would be our flagship device. Of course, we tend to get put in the bucket of the Fitbits or Apple Watches of the world, but what we really focus on is clinical reliability. Each and every one of our biometrics that we measure and output has been validated relative to the gold standard. So when it comes down to clinical research or perhaps a physician monitoring his patient, we really believe that data integrity is of the utmost importance and really where the wearable kind of competitive landscape has fallen a little bit short. So first, we have these amazing clinical grade biosensors. We also combine very unique and very customizable user applications. So we have Android and iOS applications, but the customizability allows us to really manipulate the user experience and user interface, understanding that an individual with chronic pain should perhaps not absorb data the same way as somebody just interested in longevity or athletic performance. So we can manipulate kind of how that data is ingested because this affects lifestyle modification. To tie it all together, we have this really amazing remote physiological monitoring platform where a physician would be able to log in and remotely monitor all of his patients, or perhaps a fitness professional monitor his clients. So we really make the ability to collect, analyze, and really make meaningful use of this data as seamless and efficient as possible.
That's awesome. Thank you for the overview. And can you give our listeners an idea, when you say the BioStrap is clinically validated against the gold standard, these are some really interesting, comparisons. So can you just share a few examples of what the BioStrap measures, what the gold standard is, and how close the strap is to what's considered to be the gold standard?
Yeah. So we are currently measuring greater than 65 metrics overall. The primary that the users may be most familiar with would be things like heart rate variability, oxygen saturation, respiratory rate, as well as more complex measurements around sleep and activity. But as an example, heart rate and heart rate variability, the clinical gold standard is going to be a 12-lead ECG, right? So when we're in a hospital setting, we tend to see people hooked up with all of these electrodes and wires. This is always going to be the clinical gold standard, the most reliable way of collecting these metrics, but it's perhaps not so feasible when we get to the real world. People can't walk around with these cords and wires all the time. So the idea of being able to measure this reliably at our wrist is very, exciting for physicians that will want to remotely monitor their patients. So several years ago, we did a study with Stanford University, specifically looking at our reliability of heart rate and heart rate variability relative to the 12 lead. So we did find that our heart rate measurements were plus or minus 1 beat per minute, which is as close as you can get to clinical gold standard. And then the heart rate variability is something we're constantly improving upon, and that clinical validation study was about plus or minus 5 milliseconds. What we've really shown is the trendability, the kind of consistency or precision of these metrics is spot on. When it comes to some of the other metrics like oxygen saturation, we're largely comparing ourselves to the fingertip pulse oximeters that are utilized in hospitals, such as the known-in device.
And then what about some of the more even more sophisticated measurements? Because there's some interesting. I just want to give people an understanding of the scope of how sophisticated this is. So if you're looking at measuring blood flow in the arteries, for example, if you're looking at the vasculature, or if you're looking at VO2 max, that's an interesting one. Can you speak to a couple of those as well?
Yeah. So it really attests to BioStrap's very unique data architecture. So our devices are a little bit different in the sense that they just collect raw data in its rawest form, meaning like accelerometer data XYZ. It's not counting your steps here on your wrist. We're sending this raw data up to the cloud, and this is where all of our processing takes place. So without getting too complex here, we have what's called our cloud-based pulse engine. So we send raw PPG data. We're doing complex in-depth analysis, things like beat segmentation, beat shape analysis. Then we actually reconstruct a PPG waveform, which looks a little bit like an ECG, but a little bit different to the eye here. By reconstructing the pulse wave and being able to do cloud-based analytics as opposed to algorithms here on your wrist, we're able to do things like second derivative PPG waveform analysis. Bunch of big words. Basically, we're looking at critical points in the PPG waveform that allow us to derive much deeper metrics than what most wearables are able to measure. The example that you kind of brought up there is arterial compliance, or arterial and peripheral elasticity. So here we're able to essentially look at volumetric oscillations of the arteries. Right? Every time our heart pump has this pumping action, we're going to see a diastolic and a systolic notch. And by looking at specific shape features of this, we're essentially able to look at how compliant your arteries are. The general concept: when we're young, we're active, we're healthy, we tend to have very flexible, very supple arteries. But as we get older, we make poor lifestyle choices, consume alcohol too much, whatever this may be. This ultimately leads to arterial stiffness, decreased compliance, decreases our body's ability to deliver oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. So by taking these complex metrics, we try to make it a little easier to understand for the end consumer, or in some cases even the professional, and we can deliver things like equivalent arterial ages. Because this biometric in particular declines very predictably with age, we can actually take your arterial compliance values and compare you to the normal chronological age for that value. So it's really good to make meaningful use. It's perhaps difficult to understand your arterial elasticity value, but it's easy to understand that I'm a 30-year-old male and my arteries are testing at that of a 23-year-old healthy male. So it gives you a little bit more reference. On the flip of the coin, it tends to be a good kick in the butt for some people, right? If it's a little bit older than you, it tends to get you motivated. What's great, it's one of those metrics that tends to move relatively quickly with lifestyle modification as well. Other examples of complex measurements, we're doing a lot around sleep. We are doing things like balance testing, reactive strength index, even VO2 testing, utilizing our suite of sensors. These do actually require multiple sensors to get the most precise output, but that is very unique to BioStrap as well.
It's cool to hear. I know in our other conversations, and in fact, when I was visiting with you at the office, I was able to see that using the BioStrap, using the wrist sensor and the chest sensor, between the two of those, you can actually measure VO2 and be within a couple% of the gold standard, where you're actually wearing a mask and measuring oxygen exchange, right? A gas exchange, right? I mean, would you say it was within how many percent of that gold standard?
About 2.1% for females and about 1.9% for males. So our general concept, taking a step back, I was in the high performance area for a long time, training world champion athletes, won various world championships in the combat sports. And I always wanted to basically bring what we were doing, call it very expensive, very hands-on training to everybody. And so at the time I had access to this multi-million dollar laboratory. And in our motto here, and call it crazy, is we believe we can measure just about anything that would affect your pulse waves, anything that affects things like cardiac output. We should be able to measure through PPG data analysis. So this comes down to understanding like the reference values, and then basically going to things like machine learning to be able to predict them through PPG waveform analysis. So we're really just cracking the surface of what we think ultimately we're going to be able to measure.
That's awesome. I have one more question before we turn to Ramona and dive into the study here, which we will do. One more question, in case some listeners are wondering. Okay, I have this thing on my wrist here. How is that measuring deep sleep?
So yeah, sleep is a tough one. What most companies are doing, excluding BioStrap, is relying on what we call actigraphy data. So essentially movement data, and they're making crude assumptions around things like your sleep stages, light sleep, deep sleep, REM sleep, just simply based on how much you're moving. If we look at, you're not going to find a lot of clinical validation with the competitor devices because they don't really want to prove that it's inaccurate, but it's a very crude way. I think we can all wrap our minds around why that's not the most reliable way to try and estimate your brain waves. So what we do at BioStrap here is we're comparing ourselves versus the clinical gold standard, which is PSG, polysomnography, and we're actually looking at EEGs that are interpreted by a neurologist, and we're doing our best to predict your sleep stage based on not only how much you're moving, it is one of our inputs, but also changes in things like your heart rate and your heart rate variability and even your respiratory rate. So we're utilizing PPG and your movement data to paint a more precise picture. And one thing you'll notice with BioStrap, I'm sure people will go check out our website, is we are currently not differentiating REM sleep. We are bucketing basically deep and REM into one. This is because we don't believe that it's possible at this point to differentiate REM sleep based on PPG and movement data alone. So we would rather actually not try to report that to people if we're not 100%, believe that it's precise.
That's interesting. I wish that other companies would have that discretion in reporting, waiting until they reach that confidence threshold in order to report the data. So I appreciate that. Thank you for the overview. I imagine that everyone listening to this will understand, just from hearing you speak about BioStrap for those few minutes, will understand why we believe that this is a valuable tool, why we care about the measurements that BioStrap gives us, and why we were excited to work with you on this pilot study and are excited to continue doing more with you and your team in the future. So let's turn to Ramona now. And Ramona, can you please describe to everyone listening what happened in this study, what we did?
You gave a very good description in the beginning, Garrett, that, we have these wonderful training sessions and rehab sessions that we do at NeuFit. And really our initial question was, if you're regularly attending these sessions and making progress on whatever issue you've initially come in for, especially if it has to do with pain or range of motion, how is that affecting your autonomic nervous system? Specifically, if you are improving things like your levels of pain, if you're increasing your range of motion, is that then in turn helping to improve your autonomic function? Essentially, is your body in a more parasympathetic state? Are you more, feeling more rested? Are you able to sleep better? And that's where we saw the BioStrap being a really excellent tool to use to measure and determine if there were any changes we were seeing. So the basic structure of the study was we recruited roughly 18 participants. It was, we wanted between 15 and 20 for this first round. I think we had 18 total. They ranged in ages and by sex. We didn't really put a cap on that too much. So we had everyone, some of our participants were, 22 all the way up to 61. And then what we had them do was we had them come in, do our normal evaluation, go through finding hot spots, and they all had to have some kind of orthopedic pain that they were seeking to improve. And then we would do 2 Neubie sessions with them a week for 1 month. So that gave them a total of 8 training sessions. And then they wore the BioStrap before they started their sessions. And it's important to know all of these participants had not been using the Neubie regularly for at least 6 months, if ever. And so we gave them 2 weeks prior to their first session, prior to the evaluation. We had them start wearing the BioStrap, wear it every day to get a baseline, what their regular health was in terms of those, biometrics, and then wear it through the Neubie sessions, and then continue to wear it for at least 7 days following their final session, so that we could see if there was any effect of the training that maintained through that 7-day period, quote unquote, the washout period, or if it was things that really you saw differences specific to those training times.
Awesome. Thank you, Ramona. And Kevin, this framework of 2 weeks baseline and then some sort of intervention period and then an additional week at the end, this washout, that's a framework that you've used, your general framework that you use when you're testing various interventions with the BioStrap, right?
Correct. Yeah. So we call this a phase-based intervention trial. So in some of these technologies, it's very difficult to do, call it a double-blind placebo-controlled type of study. Neubie, as an example, you can't necessarily put it on somebody and trick them into thinking that they're, shocked isn't the right word, but being stimulated, right? Their muscles are being stimulated. So when you come to this type of research, it's actually best to establish an individual baseline and then start an intervention phase and look at basically individual variants from an established physiological set point. So as Ramona mentioned, we did 2 weeks where no intervention. We just want to follow each one of these individuals, ask them to not modify their nutrition or their, exercise habits or anything like that. Get an objective understanding of their physiological set point, their heart rate variability, their sleep quality, and everything in between. And then we start our intervention. So for a total of 4 weeks, 2 sessions per week, we started to apply these interventions in a very structured manner. We look at basically physiological change. And then as I'm not sure if Ramona mentioned, is a small washout phase towards the end as well, where we then actually withdraw the intervention and we try to look at, was there a lasting physiological impact or did it essentially return back to baseline immediately? So this was the general structure of the study, and something we do replicate kind of intervention by intervention, but often would vary the number of weeks in each phase.
And using this framework, what else? What other interventions have you looked at using that same sort of framework and the BioStrap?
So what we really focus on with BioStrap Labs is validating commercial products that we can get behind, that we believe in. So we're looking primarily at non-invasive wellness technologies that perhaps want to validate their product, but are in clinical studies that'll take several years to see the light of day. Right? Unfortunately, there's some issues with timelines and costs with real clinical validation. So some examples would be the Theragun by Therabody, so percussive therapy. Some general, research has been done on percussive therapy in general, but not specifically their device. So we showed in a matter of a 3-minute pre-sleep routine, just utilizing it for a few minutes prior to bed each night, that it actually increased sleep duration by about 4.5 minutes. So perhaps doesn't sound, worth shouting off the mountaintops, but it showed that by basically dedicating a few minutes to active recovery actually saved you time. Another example would be studies that we've done with pulsed electromagnetic field therapy, as well as the current study that we're looking at with low light level therapy, or what people would look at as red light therapy.
Awesome. That was cool. And when I was visiting your office to hear you kind of point to things and say, yeah, we validated that worked. We looked at that didn't work as well. And you could, it was really cool. It was really cool to see. So thank you for sharing that. So we've gone through what the study actually was, what we did, what happened, and or what we did. And now, Ramona, can you tell us, please, what happened, what we actually found in the study?
Yeah, so there was a few metrics that we found that were, the most exciting to us and the things we really wanted to focus on. First and foremost, we were really interested in perception of pain and range of motion, right? Because with these participants, right, you want them to feel like they've had a change. So pain specifically, the majority of our participants reported that they felt that their pain had decreased over the period of their 4-week sessions, as well as their range of motion, which I think, that's the biggest question in my mind in terms of just performance output is, are these patients feeling like they can actually increase their range of motion? Are they able to feel less pain? But in turn, then to look at those autonomic numbers, the question is, if they have those improvements, is that showing up with sleep, HRV specifically, or their heart rate? So probably the most exciting thing that we noticed when we first looked over the data, Garrett, was that the majority of participants actually showed a decrease in their resting heart rate after this training regimen. And really, our training does not involve any cardiovascular training. So this is just showing, an improvement in their cardiovascular health from the Neubie alone. And matching with that was showing that there was this majority of our participants showing that their HRV improved over the duration of the study as well. And that one actually, I think, was really interesting because for the first couple weeks of the study, you saw this increase in HRV, and then it somewhat plateaued, kind of indicating that the participants were actually adjusting to the Neubie, right? Their body was adjusting to a new stimulus and to that different kind of training, and it was showing a positive improvement. And then as their body adjusted, of course, things settled back into essentially a new baseline. And then sleep was the other big one. So we saw an increase in their sleep efficiency, meaning, they just didn't wake up as much through the night, and they had more time in deep sleep, which would be indicative of improvements in pain as well as range of motion, because, a lot of times I certainly, if I'm in pain, will have more awakenings throughout the night. So feeling better is going to, end up showing those same metrics. And so that I was like, Kevin might be able to speak to the BioStrap recovery score the best, but that was sort of the accumulation of those metrics like HRV, sleep efficiency, and I know there's one more, Kevin. What's the third metric that the BioStrap has its own recovery score that then they sort of show you when you wake up every day and look at your biometrics. And we saw that we did see a average of 7% increase in recovery score. So Kevin, I'm going to give you a little moment to talk about that number because that is something pretty specific.
Yeah. So the BioStrap recovery score, it's a very individualized approach to recovery. Understanding we can't look at two people's data side by side, like a single snapshot of data, and look at who's more recovered. So what we do here, kind of a testament to the importance of establishing a baseline, is compare their biometric values today for a resting heart rate variability, sleep efficiency, and sleep duration relative to their own trailing 5 to 30 day baseline. So it's completely individual. And so, yeah, a 7% increase is extremely significant. Once again, perhaps these from the outside looking in, that it doesn't sound that significant, but we've tested tons of interventions from nutrition and exercise to, more expensive or invasive recovery methods, and 7% is extremely significant.
That's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, Ramona, the details there, and Kevin, that commentary. That BioStrap recovery score, it's cool to hear you describe it because, people might see that, we have this infographic that we'll share on the link here, and people might see that and not know exactly what it is. So I think that's really useful to hear you say that. So it's a combination, you said, of heart rate variability, resting heart rate, deep sleep, or
sleep efficiency and sleep duration.
Efficiency. So efficiency is how, not waking up during the night and spending more time in deep sleep as opposed to lighter sleep stages, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's essentially the amount of time spent in restorative sleep relative to the amount of time in bed. So this is going to account for things like sleep latency, how long it takes you to fall asleep, as well as the number and duration of awakenings. To me, one of the most important things that we really quantified throughout the study was the improvement in sleep efficiency. When you look at what is chronic pain, right? 20.4% of the population suffers from chronic pain, 7.4% high impact chronic pain that really affects quality of life, the ability to show up and work every single day, opioid dependence, all these types of things. And you look at what is the marked physiological factors or phenotypes in chronic pain, and it's basically decreased heart rate variability and poor sleep quality, right? Chronic pain in general is marked by a significant increase in microarousals and the number and duration of awakenings. So there's a lot of research out there. We've always really known that sleep and pain are related, but we're actually learning more that sleep disruptions are a better predictor of pain than pain is of sleep disruption. So we're actually painting a better picture in terms of kind of like why pain manifests, and poor sleep quality is a big part of it. So the ability to basically objectively quantify that, yeah, these people are reporting 21% decrease in pain, 27% increase of range of motion. These are excellent. We want to understand why. I think part of this showed that we're actually helping people get more restorative deep sleep and stay asleep longer, despite the same amount of time in bed. We're improving their sleep efficiency.
If you're ready to supercharge your practice, listen to this. Garrett and Team NeuFit have just released a new online course entitled Introduction to the NeuFit Method. In this detailed 8-hour course, you'll gain mastery of the fundamental techniques in our practice, including muscle testing and activations, nerve glides, and joint articulations. You'll also get introduced to our patented direct current stimulation device, the Neubie, an incredible machine that's empowered professionals just like you to help their patients heal, adapt, and grow faster than they ever thought possible. To learn more, go to www.neu.fit/learn. And now back to the show.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's a really helpful insight there. And one take-home message for me is the quality over quantity discussion. Someone might think, "Oh, I was in bed for 9 hours. I must have gotten fabulous sleep." But if you don't spend enough of that time in deep sleep, or I think people understand if they're tossing and turning all night, it's not as restful. But even if you perceive yourself to be sleeping, there can still be wide ranges in the quality of that sleep and how restful it is and how restorative it can be. So thank you for sharing that. So
yeah, I'd like to.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry,
Yeah.
Garrett. Yeah, to kind of piggyback on that too, especially when it comes to that increase in sleep efficiency with working with the Neubie, it's really exciting because our Neubie sessions are very taxing on the body. It's essentially like a very intense training session, whether it's for rehab or actually, we use it often for fitness training. So if you're able to then see an increase in sleep efficiency, that's relating that they're getting better rest and recovery, which is going to contribute to them being able to improve that performance, with more and more work on the Neubie. So it's especially exciting. It kind of like compounds on itself that if they can get better rest because they're working with the Neubie, they can also train harder because they're with the Neubie. So it's pretty exciting.
And to piggyback on that, one of the things that I think is really important for our listeners to understand is that when we're doing, therapy sessions or training sessions, whatever we're doing, we're trying to provide a stimulus for the body, and then the body has to adapt to that stimulus if we want to make changes in the structure and function of the body. And the biggest opportunity for adaptation, the most important window of time for adaptation, is absolutely during sleep. I think everyone would agree with that. That's when we're not only restoring energy, when we're remodeling tissues, remodeling neurological pathways, when we're making neuroplastic changes. Those happen primarily during REM sleep. More structural tissue modifications and improvements are going to happen more during deep sleep. So there's a lot of importance there. And it's really wonderful to hear, Kevin, your comments on the statistics around pain and sleep. And then to your point, Ramona, that when people are providing a meaningful input or intervention, that sleep is so important because it also tells us that they're having an opportunity to actually adapt in response to that and incorporate whatever that input is that that we desire to share with them, that they're actually having a chance to integrate it and incorporate that into their body to improve their structure and function. So very good. I appreciate those insights from both of you. One of the things that we observed, and I'll put this up to both of you and see if either of you wants to jump in and answer it first. The effect, Ramona mentioned one parameter that kind of increased and then plateaued. There were a couple others that we saw that actually stayed fairly flat until part way through the study and then started to increase. And there seemed to be this sort of cumulative effect where there had to be some sort of critical mass, or it seemed like the body had to reach some threshold before those variables would change. Can either of you speak to that and share some more details and what you think might be happening there?
Yeah, I'm going to start with one that I realized we didn't mention in sort of the reporting of the initial study findings. One that we thought was really interesting was peripheral elasticity, which Kevin spoke to as, kind of being, it's a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around, but arterial age and elasticity of your arteries speaking to your arterial health. So we saw that at the end of the 4 weeks of training, there was a significant increase in peripheral elasticity, and that it continued to increase a little bit into the washout as well, which kind of spoke to that ramp up of the body adjusting and then showing those improvements. But it did take a little bit of time before that started to show up. But as we were ending the study, you could see it kind of continue to climb up, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think to expand upon your previous point, Garrett, it's important to understand the difference between the stressor phase and the adaptation phase. People in general, I'll take athletes as an example, very good at applying stress, not so good at understanding that adaptation occurs primarily during phases of sleep and recovery, right? So when we take like for resting heart rate, for example, Neubie is a stressful kind of thing on the body, right? This is what forces the adaptation. So when we looked at the first phase of the intervention phase, we actually saw an acute increase in resting heart rate. Very similar to actually what we would see from taking somebody from sedentary to active. Their nocturnal heart rate will slightly increase, but over time it takes the body a little while to make these physiological adaptations. Whereas by the end of the intervention phase and throughout the washout phase, we saw day-to-day improvements in heart rate variability and decreases in nocturnal heart rate, which is what we love to see. We're showing less systemic stress, improved, cardiorespiratory efficiency, but these do not happen during the stress phase. So it's important to look at the intervention as very important. It's a very necessary step, but that washout phase to me was one of the most important because we look at the body's ability in the absence of the intervention. Is it continuing to adapt, or is it basically, reliant on the intervention itself?
Yeah, and I believe, Kevin, that some of the data, as well as we looked into that washout data, which was so important, we want to see that that those improvements are continuing to happen. But then towards the end of that 7-day period, some of those improvements, like the deep sleep time, started to return back to baseline levels, which kind of speaks to the complement of training with something that's a stressor and very challenging to the body, but that stimulus improving deep sleep, but it's a balance. This is why we wouldn't train every single day. You need the time to recover, but if you stop training altogether, those improvements in your measurements are going to start to go back down.
Yeah, absolutely, great point. And I think that's a testament to another reason why we did this study. We want to understand specifically how people are adapting to it, so we can learn more and enhance our protocols. Exactly. If we were to stack session after session, day after day, we're not giving people enough time to adapt. So by actually looking at the data changes in between the sessions, we're getting better insight into how the technology is working at a physiological level.
And similarly, we did see, speaking to that recovery time, that washout, when we talk about our participants showing an improvement in their pain scores and their range of motion, we did see some improvements during the training itself, but really the biggest changes were what was seen in that washout, in that time when now they've kind of gone through this intense 4-week intervention, and now their body's having a chance to really fully recover. That's when you saw them really start to report these bigger changes in those scores.
Yeah, that was very interesting, and I think important for another thing for people listening to understand is that the pain did improve during the intervention phase. It was actually when we stopped the protocol that we saw the most significant and lasting improvements. That was very interesting. And I think that's why there's a benefit to packages instead of somebody coming in for a single session, because they expect their pain to decrease very quickly, and that's just not quite how the human body responds to this type of stimulus.
Right, exactly. That's something, right? We don't have someone come in and say, we're going to solve your problem today. It's going to be consistent work that's, so that your body adapts. And then those changes, they last longer and longer, the longer that you consistently work on them.
It's cool to see that, a lot of these things that we read about in the exercise physiology textbooks about stressors and adaptation and supercompensation, it's cool to see them really come to life. And one thing that I'll mention just for our listeners here is that there's really a lot of overlap between effective therapy and effective training, because our goals really are the same. We're trying to remodel tissues, improve movement and coordination and speed and strength, and get the body into a state where it can adapt. That adaptation might mean healing an injury, or it might mean building bigger muscles or stronger connective tissue, whatever it is, but the goals are so similar. And so when we sometimes talk about therapy sessions as training sessions here, and vice versa, because there is so much overlap, and looking at a lot of these underlying health parameters. A lot of this is in the exercise physiology realm. And I'm part of why I'm really excited about this study is that we're bringing this line of conversation and this line of analysis into the physical therapy, orthopedic, chiropractic space, where there often is not really any sort of or it's not really part of the dialogue very often. And I think that's a really cool piece of this line of inquiry, and one of the impacts that I believe we'll be able to have is kind of shifting that dialogue. So really good insights. Thank you both. Let's turn now to what conclusions can we draw. So we already talked, this is a pilot study, a wide range of ages in participants, and had all sorts of different types of pains or symptoms when they were coming in. What conclusions can we draw? What conclusions can we not draw? How would you interpret this? I'll start with Ramona, then we'll go to Kevin.
Sure. I think, yeah, Gary, you definitely nailed it on the head. When you're doing a bigger study or something, you do want to kind of pare down your variables as much as possible. So obviously here, having like a broad range of participants, both male and female participants, different levels of pain, is going to add some changes. But that's obviously the importance of having that baseline data, as Kevin spoke to earlier, is that allows us to kind of, you can compare anybody's reported changes back to themselves and back to where they started. But I think we just spoke about the changes that we started to see happening over that 4-week period. And a lot of times when we have people come in for sessions, we usually suggest 4 to 6 weeks of regular sessions before you can have that change. And I think this really speaks to that it takes roughly a month before you start to see those big and lasting changes to the body from your rehab or training sessions. So if we were to go forward and do another study, Kevin and I have talked about going out, maybe make it a 6-week study, so that we could really start to see how those changes we saw at 4 weeks, if they continue to change with 2 more weeks of training, and give it that time to really spread out and fully evaluate it. And so I think that also a lot of times when we put together our protocols, we tend to look at 10 to 12 sessions. So it's 5 to 6 weeks. And this really supports that. That says that that is about right. We should be giving 10 to 12 sessions to really start to see those big changes. So that would be my first one. Kevin, if you want to take a go, I'll think of more.
Yeah, I think what we really learned is, it is eliciting favorable physiological adaptations. We did not necessarily have the population size of everything controlled well enough to shout off the mountaintop statistical significance, but every metric that we cared about was moving in the proper direction, specifically heart rate variability. We saw day-to-day compounding improvements, right? So if we were to extend the intervention phase a little bit longer, there's no doubt that this would have reached a state of statistical significance. But the fact that we also saw the decreased resting heart rate, which the AHA will tell you all day, we want as low of a resting heart rate as possible, improvements in sleep efficiency, confirmed what we essentially already knew around pain and range of motion and such, but just to look at every single one of our metrics and to see everything trending in the right direction, and really no maladaptation, nothing where we saw that we're perhaps introducing some unknown risk to the participants. It's always good to look at these variables as well. I think it confirms once again what we already know. We're directly impacting the autonomic nervous system. And now it's about bringing it back to the drawing board and just refining our protocols a little bit.
Yeah, and that will nicely lead into one other conclusion that we have, is that if we really want to evaluate the Neubie's effect on the autonomic nervous system, we have protocols that Garrett mentioned at the very beginning of the podcast, like the Master Reset, which the whole goal is to work and improve and support the autonomic nervous system. So if that, going forward with those next steps and next stages of what we want to look at, I think that maybe we start to evaluate, do we want to use a protocol that's really specifically aimed at that? Or, do we want to continue to evaluate what rehab can do? And if this is sort of a side effect of the regular training sessions is that you're getting improvements in autonomic function, well, that's awesome.
Kevin, can you speak to, I know it's anecdotal, very informal, very rough. Can you speak to that one day, one time before and after intervention that you tried with the master reset, just to speak to that? That's something for, in case everyone doesn't know, it's like Ramona said, it's a protocol that we use that is specifically intended to stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system. It's sort of like if you do a guided meditation or breathing exercise to shift down the fight or flight response and increase the rest and digest side of the nervous system. This stimulates the vagus nerve and is meant to amplify that sort of thing. Can you speak to that with the caveat that it was very rough? You just did it with some people in your office, but
Yeah, of course. So specifically what I was very interested in that particular little pilot study, we'll call it, was the acute effects of the master reset, right? So this study we're more focused on the chronic, nocturnal benefits, the adaptation over time. I wanted to see before and after, what is this doing to my body? And I will tell you, it was one of the most profound experiences from a data perspective. I didn't necessarily walk away from it feeling extremely different. When you looked at the data and you saw this profound increase in arterial elasticity, blood flow, right? Acute, I think it was 30% or so improvement in heart rate variability right off the bat before and after. Decrease in resting heart rate, increase in oxygen saturation. Every single metric that I care about and value from a health perspective had an immediate acute impact. And I had tested, very expensive, more invasive transcranial deep brain stimulations and all these ones making claims about the ability to affect your nervous system immediately. And I essentially disproved each and every single one of them, because my thought process going into it is you can't manipulate the nervous system like that quickly, that profoundly. And I stood corrected and was so pleased that, Garrett and I have stayed good friends since then. And I think that's ultimately what led to this study as well.
I think I'm sold on that. That should be the next one that we do there. But so for everyone who's kind of has a Neubie, is using this, you're familiar with the master reset. For those of you who aren't, it is sort of like electronic meditation is something that we call. You're lying down with electrodes on. Two of them are going to be at the back of the neck, so we're going to stimulate the vagus nerve. The other two can be elsewhere in the body, typically, down on the feet or on the hands, but, typically head to toe. And we do see these really, really cool shifts like Kevin described there. So the good news is that we have plenty more to study as well. So we had a really, really exciting pilot here, and there's definitely more content, more fodder for further studies. So thank you both for sharing what happened in the study, sharing your perspective here. Ramona, it's a pleasure working with you, our Director of Research and Clinical Education. I think I left that off when I introduced you. And Kevin, the brilliant Chief Science Officer of BioStrap and BioStrap Labs. Thank you both for joining us. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in and listening to this episode of the Undercurrent Podcast. Thank you so much for listening to the Undercurrent Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a review and be sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we release future episodes.